We'll wait just a few more minutes as participants filter in. Okay, great. We're getting up to a critical mass here, and I can see some friends and comrades and colleagues in the participants list. So welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Christy Thornton, and I'm the co-director of the History and Political Economy Project. Before we begin, I just want to give a special thanks to the Boston University Global Development Policy Center, which has been partnering with us for these webinars, and especially to their staffer, Angie, who has been helping us today on getting this webinar all set up. And a huge thanks also as well to the HPE Project postdoctoral fellow, Andrew Anastasi, for all of his support and organizing work. He worked so hard to get us all together here today. So thank you, Andrew. This is a third in a series of webinars organized by the History and Political Economy Project, which I co-direct with Quinn Slobodian, as part of our Histories and Futures of Global Governance initiative. This project, which is supported by the Open Society Foundation, Education and Ideas Collaborative, brings together historians, policymakers, reform advocates, and others to address why and how, and maybe if, history can be seen to matter for global governance reform efforts. Today, we're going to discuss how the history of activism and advocacy for reform has affected global governance institutions and what lessons we might draw from that history. I'm very grateful to have three brilliant panelists joining me here today, all scholars and activists in their own rights. I'll introduce them briefly now. I'll direct a few questions to the group for a chat for 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open to discussion from the audience. So please use the Q&A function in the webinar to send your question, and I'll present them and ask them to the panelists after we've finished our little conversation here. So first, Paul Adlerstein is Associate Professor of History at Colorado College. His teaching focuses on social and political movements, as well as 20th century US history and international political economy. His research explores progressive and left internationalist movements with a focus on global inequality and anti-neoliberal activism. He's the author of No Globalization Without Representation, U.S. Activists and World Inequality, and he's currently working on a report with Justice is Global, as well as a new book on the global history of the U.S. left. He serves on the advisory board of our group, the History and Political Economy Project, and he's worked on global justice issues at the advocacy group Global Trade Watch. Next, Bhumika Muchala. I'm sorry, I said I wouldn't mispronounce your name, and then I just did it right away. Next, Bhumika Muchala is a senior advisor to the Third World Network and adjunct faculty in the Global Economic and Environmental Governance at the New School. She has 20 years of experience in global governance and global justice, leading advocacy, analysis, and movements focused on debt and fiscal justice, systemic reforms, and a just transition for the Global South. Her interdisciplinary research is engaged with the politics and mechanisms of international financial subordination through political economy theories from the South. She has a PhD in international relations from the New School and an MSc in development economics from the London School of Economics. Finally, we're so thrilled to be joined by Walden Bello, who probably needs no introduction in this room, but just to give a brief one, Walden is a sociologist, author, and activist currently serving as International Adjunct Professor at SUNY Binghamton and Senior Research Fellow at Kyoto University. And he's joining us today from Bangkok, where it is very late. So we're very grateful that he's here, and hopefully he can stick with us as long as we can have him. Walden's a longtime critic of corporate globalization. He's authored 25 books, including Development Debacle and Counter-Revolution, The Rise of the Far Right. Bello was a key figure in the international movement against the Marcos dictatorship and later served in the Philippine Congress, where he championed labor and human rights legislation. He co-founded Focus on the Global South, where he's co-chair, and has played leading roles in global justice movements, including anti-WTO protests and peace missions to conflict zones. In 2003, he received the Right to Livelihood Award for his promotion of alternatives to neoliberal globalization. So thank you all so much for being here today. I'll start by saying that as we've been discussing in our earlier webinars, efforts to reform these institutions of global governance began basically as soon as the institutions were created, attempting to democratize institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, various UN institutions, and others. And these campaigns have attempted to make these bodies more transparent and to make them more useful for the development aspirations of the Global South. In our first webinars, we discussed how this long history of attempts at reform might matter for today's reformers, and how these institutions have historically resisted the pressure to reform, and what the priorities have been at the forefront for actors from the Global South, especially. So today we're going to focus specifically on the question of activism, organizing, and advocacy from outside the institutions, to ask how this long history of resistance to IFI policy has impacted things like the theoretical frameworks, the bureaucratic functioning, and the policy frameworks of these institutions. So I wanted to start with a kind of history of these movements, and how you see them beginning. I thought we would start with Walden, since as a participant in these movements for so long. Walden, can you tell us a little bit about how you understand this long history of social movement conflicts with institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, later obviously the WTO? What are the goals of the movements you've participated in, and how has that activism changed over time?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Christy, for inviting me to this wonderful discussion. And, reflecting on the questions that were sent to me, I thought I'd give a short personal reflection on my involvement with two movements. One was the movement, or what we call the anti-globalization movement, in the late 90s and in the 2000s. And the second one was the anti-war movement, specifically against the US intervention in Afghanistan and Iraq, and what made those two movements sort of special. I think what we have right now is in the United States, of course, which has been, the central player in, so many global developments, is a president that has basically forsworn globalization and, in fact, attacked it. And we have a situation whereby neoliberalism has been very much discredited. And it's also a precedent that, despite the aggressive rhetoric when it comes to trade, is gun shy. Basically, I think he realizes that the last thing, I mean, the one thing that would really create problems for him would be to get into another war. And I think that this the situation where you in fact have somebody like Trump there stems very much from the work of social movements. And with respect to the anti-globalization movement, I think it was very important, a mistake that was made early in the 90s, where the World Trade Organization was presented as the jewel in the crown of multilateralism. And that was the word that was used by one of the director generals, Mike Moore. Not our Michael Moore, Mike Moore. And the thing was that they tried to bring in not only trade, but investment policy, competition policy, as they called it, and basically to make the the World Trade Organization the arbiter uh, of global rules and the cutting edge of globalization. And so that um, uh, gave movements a real focus, a real target, and an even bigger target than the World Bank and the IMF, which had already been targeted by movements. And what happened was that we had a situation whereby the WTO met um, in ministerials every 1.5 years in different places that then became magnets, for global movements in the United States, Latin America, from here in Asia, to converge in those selected places like Seattle, Doha, and then Cancun. And at the same time, I think that there was just this tremendous resentment on the part of developing country governments at the way that the Uruguay round of liberalization had not even been completed by them in terms of making their regimes compatible with the WTO, the then the big powers again demanded another round of liberalization. So basically, I think what you had was this very interesting combination that came together in Seattle of people coming from different movements, but united around one thing, which was to derail the WTO, and the developing country governments resentful coming into the negotiations, just not wanting to make any more concessions. But these two forces, that 50,000 people in the streets and the resentful developing country governments, without any planning, basically, had this synergy that resulted in derailing the World Trade Organization. And it was a historic derailment from which the WTO never recovered. And I was very happy to be part of that history in action. And of course, we had an attempt by the WTO to recover in Doha, but by dividing the developing countries. But when it came to the 2003 Cancun meeting, the developing countries had uh, been able to figure out, that they really had to resist this divide and rule. And so the WTO processes themselves became the point of resistance, especially this consensus rule that, you couldn't have policies adopted without consensus. And that was one of the fatal weaknesses of the WTO. And of course, in both Doha and Cancun, we did have civil society present again. In fact, Cancun was a big event in Cancun was the Korean a farmer who took his life in a very dramatic fashion that basically was one of the factors that contributed to the walkout by the developing country delegates. And after 2003, basically that was practically the end of the World Trade Organization as engine of global trade liberalization. The American officials there said that, okay, we're just going to not worked with the WTO. We're going to have different trade agreements with different, and in any way, I think that it was trade liberalization, looking back now, was really downhill from there. And of course, we came to the big crisis in 2008. So basically, it was this really fantastic synergy between global mass movements and developing country governments that was so central in making that sort of derailing uh, 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 liberalization and neoliberalism and globalization. Okay, so that's the first example. The second example that, again, I was involved with was the anti-war movement. Um, and I think going back to those days when, um, uh, after 9/11, you had the invasion of Afghanistan. And then, of course, people were still a bit shocked by 9/11. But by the time that the invasion of Iraq came, you already had, this tremendous global movement that the New York Times, in fact, back in 2003, right before the invasion of Iraq, said this was the world's second superpower. The first was the United States, and that the second superpower was basically saying no to war. And so, uh, so basically, the Bush administration provoked two things with the invasion of Iraq. It, basically swallowed the bait of Osama bin Laden. Okay, and basically bin Laden was operating with a kind of version of Che Guevara's FOCO theory, whereby you draw the enemy into an unwinnable war because you force him to overextend. And so that led to this 20-year war that was impossible to win because it generated so much resistance throughout the Middle East, from different, in so many different ways, and in so many different countries in the region. And so, so, but I think the second superpower, which was global civil society, as the New York Times called us, also played a central role. Because unless we take into consideration the fact that there was this huge anti-war movement that just kept on building up until basically Petraeus uh, uh, announced the drawdown of US troops around 2007, 2008. If the wars had not been delegitimized by global civil society, they could have gone on forever. Okay, so that while the movements in the Middle East, the popular resistance played a central role, nevertheless, I think what you had with these global movements was, also played a very central role in delegitimizing those wars so that it made it impossible to keep on carrying it out. So, so again, this very interesting intersection between global civil society and the armed resistance movements in the Middle East. And so you had the same sort of synergy that you had displayed in the anti-globalization movement. So, of course, one of the big questions, and I'll just end with this, is really just like the war in Vietnam, the after the 1973 peace accords, the anti-war movement in you know uh, uh, died down, in around the Bush administration's wars. And then, of course, there was uh, the anti-globalization movement. Yes, it was continued with the Occupy movement, but um, but also, it definitely also had some sort of unending. People basically said, why couldn't it be institutionalized? Why do these movements rise then peter out? And maybe those are the questions that we need to be asking here. But all I'm saying, and I'll just end with this, is that here you had two successful movements against neoliberalism on the one hand and against war on the other hand, and that the alliances that were created um, in both were not planned, but they did come together. And it was those coming together between global South governments and global civil society on the one hand, in the case of the WTO, and Middle East resistance movements, and the second superpower, as the New York Times called us, uh, also having that sort of synergy that ended the imperial venture in the Middle East. And of course, I think that it would be, I think that to a great extent, what happened with respect to the rise of the the movement against, the genocide being carried out in Gaza, um, its roots were also in this anti-war movement. Okay, so let me just end there. Those are just
Okay.
some personal reflections.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate that. I appreciate your emphasis on the importance of the synergy with global South governments. That's something that we've been talking about in these webinars for sure, and something that we want to continue to consider. On the idea of derailing the WTO, one of the questions is sort of about what the goals of particular social movement mobilizations or organizations are and when they are in conflict with one another, right? So the idea of simply, shutting down the WTO, shutting down the World Bank and the IMF versus sort of reform efforts and how those intersect. I do think pointing out the extent to which quite spectacular and large and sometimes extreme actions like the death of the Korean trade unionist that you mentioned, in some sense, open space for other kinds of movements to happen. And I think we've seen that throughout history. So I really appreciate these reflections. And the question of how should the movements be institutionalized, I think is a really key one. Bhumika, I know that you sort of came from a social movement background and you've been working more in sort of advocacy policy sorts of worlds. So do you want to describe your own, in the way that Walden did, your own approach to this and how you see that transition from kind of social movement mobilization to the kind of advocacy, lobbying, research work that you've been doing?
Sure, yes, thank you. And thank you for holding this discussion. It's rare, I think, to have this sort of reflexive and analytical assessment that really goes through time and space and geography. So I really appreciate it. Thanks to the History and Political Economy Network. So I would start really with highlighting that the global justice movement has different origin points, different epistemic points between different geographies. For much of the global South, it is really the imperative of decolonization. The decolonization movement, let's start, with the Bandung Conference, 1955, and the birth of the new international economic order. It is about the structural dependencies and the fact fact that political decolonization had been achieved, but there was a recognition that this did not translate to economic decolonization of the newly independent nations. So there was a real ethos of birthing a new interdependent world order that redressed unequal terms of trade, supported economic diversification, and reformed the Bretton Woods institutions. This is markedly distinct from the origins in the North, especially in the 1980s, 1990s, the consumer activist movement, the environmental movement, which really didn't yet have a intersectional, structural, or historical lens, right? So we have these really different origin points that were coming together in a really unique way, a historically unique way. So we're coming from the structural adjustment programs of the 1980s in the Global South. And this is what really heightened the awareness of the IMF and World Bank's central role in the subordination and disarticulation of Global South nations, right? So you have the rearing of the neoliberal agenda that we're all too familiar with as a counterpoint to the new international economic order. And, this really centered the role of IMF, World Bank, which is really, I have been very much centered around those two institutions and, of course, the World Trade Organization. So I think we landed, this critical mass in Seattle, right? And we were decentralized, grassroots, people-led, a massive force of trade unions, right? Which was very specific to that moment. We see this dismantling of trade unions so systematically across the world, but definitely here as well. And you have, very interestingly, these networks of grassroots political education through these concentric circles of teach-ins. It was not yet, policy expert driven or, top down. It was, small groups of, primarily university students putting together political teach-ins. And, we would be as a student activist at that time of Seattle, we would be in church basements, we would be in classrooms, we would be all over the place expecting, 5 or 6 people to show up, even less, and then hundreds would show up. And we had far from a cogent analytical understanding at that time. But what was really interesting was there was actually an internationalist ethos of solidarity and resistance coming from a place of moral outrage, which is so interesting to trace, how that has transformed, how it has taken different shape. I look back and it was really not necessarily sort of theory or history of capitalism that we were rooted in, but it was these case studies of labor rights abuses, ecological harm, dispossession, and it was really based on that driving of moral outrage. So there we were, tens of thousands on the streets, in Seattle, in Cancun, as Walden said, very much with the leadership of Focus on the Global South and also other key folks, like from Global Trade Watch, and I'd like to highlight like Vandana Shiva and my colleague Martin Core from Third World Network. So, it was interesting. We were across silos and sectors, right? And it was Another World is Possible, which was a counter to Tina, There Is No Alternative. And there was really a sense that the power of the collective can confront these transnational corporations and governments. There really was a sense of agency. Now, what happened after that is what I'd like to briefly trace. What happened after these protests that were front page news headlines that were that were directly implicating IMF, World Bank, and that were placing these institutions in the context of this resistance. And of course, the media would highlight the violence very disproportionately. But what happened afterwards is a tale of counterinsurgency by the Bretton Woods institutions, where key funders and a rather contained constellation of organizations drove the professionalization of youth activists into technocratic policy advocacy in a modus operandi of incremental reform and damage control. The creation of the Civil Society Policy Forum in 2005 was to diffuse, neutralize, and depoliticize the threat that we posed in the social movements, the mobilization for global justice. So the Bretton Woods institutions deployed very well-known techniques, right, of social engineering. So I'd like to highlight one particular, there's a range of these sorts of techniques, but inclusionary control. Inclusionary control was a really key technique. It involved bureaucratic and procedural methods of inclusion and participation that created a new subject position. That new subject position was that of the international civil society, the stakeholder. And this is then, really shifted our identity from global justice movement leaders, activists, citizens, even rebels, to change agents from the inside. And it really created a taboo or a kind of I wouldn't say vilification, but it created a hierarchy of disruptor, antagonist versus advocate, stakeholder. And the role of funders was key in this, in creating watchdog and monitoring organizations that did advocacy from the inside. And I want to highlight that this took place in an environment of political hygiene that really was a marked turn from the movement ethos. And in fact, I look back and it was an inherently neoliberal logic in that the unequal power structures and relations are left unperturbed and intact, while the IMF and World Bank can be visibly seen and, performatively laud their inclusion by inviting advocates to contribute and participate, right? The cucumber and tea buffets and the consultations and the dialogues. So one of the other aspects is this discursive legitimization that they really embarked on in winning over the hearts and minds of activists and activists. And this was a pacification effort that involved these really a long drawn out processes of consultations on every paper or research or different initiative. So then they created participation forums such as the town halls, and a wide and impressive range of media mechanisms, TV interviews, blog posts, op-eds, including a daily news dissemination list that advocates could get on. This has to be contextualized within the history of the doctrine of counterinsurgency, born as a technology of empire. It has a long history. In fact, we need to recall that development itself is an integral feature of counterinsurgency. Former President Harry Truman's 1949 inaugural address actually introduced development as a foreign policy tool and formalized it as a counterinsurgency methodology to win the hearts and minds of recalcitrant populations. So, I share this, history that I was very much a part of, but I will also say this: it is not a simple story. It is not a binary story. All this said, the advocacy within institutions has indeed led to real policy and narrative shifts, which I'm happy to explain or describe. But the advocacy has been a vital force for change and action, particularly when advocates hold the line and push the envelope of the status quo. So we need to also disaggregate the world of advocacy between those who sort of perform and those who are really making the links to grassroots movements in the South that are not traveling to the IMF World Bank spring and annual meetings. And I think I apologize, but I didn't clarify that Civil Society Policy Forum is held during the annual and spring meetings of the IMF and World Bank, and this was created in 2005 to include international civil society from around the world through a rigorous process of applying for a badge and applying and proposing sessions and seminars that can be held with the staff of the IMF World Bank. So I'll end there, but there's a lot more that really went on, and I just want to highlight that this assessment is an honest look at the sort of the politics of what transpired, but it does not disavow the integrity of advocates. Um, but I think an honest look is oftentimes missing in terms of how this sector was born and what happened to the movement activists. Some got professionalized, but some very much went on to other forms of movement building, especially in this context of the United States and Western Europe. There was a shift to identity politics, intersectional movement building, and to anti-war. And these areas, while legitimate and critical on their own terms, really diminished the space. It diminished the space for internationalism. It diminished the space for a public and audible and visible ethos of international solidarity, which then I do believe got reduced, dramatically reduced to particular nations or particular sanction cases,
Hmm.
but not as systemic as not as historical, political, and systemic as it used to be. So that ethos, I do think we are bringing it back in many ways. We are bringing it back in many ways. Especially COVID was a game changer in bringing back this ethos through a more um, systemic analysis that takes on power, capital, colonialism, past to present. There's a revival of movements. We have now very vibrant discourses on climate and historical colonial reparations, ideology and knowledge production, degrowth, just transition, and recent efforts to revive a new international economic order too, with a Congress that was held in Havana by Progressive International. So it's not a harking back to that idealism of another world as possible, but it's actually a really interesting structuralist endeavor to historicize and politicize that may not have the firepower visibility of the global justice movement, but is a different kind of turn.
Hmm. Thank you so much for that. I think those are really important reflections. And this question of the sort of the mechanisms that lead to the professionalization, to the NGOization, as one book put it, of this sector, I think are really important. Paul, I wonder, given that you are the historian here who has done the kind of historical research about this, how you see this transition and where you think we are now. Like, are we in a place where we are just, all we have are the sort of professional consultative mechanisms? Do we need more of the outside movement pressure? How do you see that evolution?
Yeah, thank you. I think that just as and maybe we can talk about this at some point, the global justice movement has a prehistory, right? It also has a history that has continued. And I think where we see some of the greatest efficacy, and I think this builds off of some of what Walden and Bumiha were saying, was I've been thinking about one of the other kind of great victories of the global justice era, which was the defeat of the free trade area of the Americas. And that was a case where, so you have this historical moment where, right, in the late 90s, basically all of Latin America and the Caribbean have varying kinds of neoliberal friendly governments besides Cuba. And then you start having what no one was going to call the pink tide for many years, but you have Chavez's victory, and I forget if it was 97 or 98. And then kind of this buildup of political parties at the same time as you have the growth of social movements that were responding to the defeat for global justice advocates of NAFTA's passage, and then also the US-Chile free trade agreement. So you have the rise of the Hemispheric Social Alliance, which is an organization of trade unions, peasants' movements, feminist organizations, on, who saw NAFTA's defeat, but also saw that NAFTA was like a well-waged fight by its opponents. And so they're learning from some of the models that happened in the US, Canada, and especially Mexico of creating cross-sector alliance organizations. And that the Hemispheric Social Alliance brought people together to coordinate strategy. But I think that's one of those places where when you focus too much on the transnational, you can get into that, oh, they just had meetings and passed resolutions, whatever, except that everyone's also going home armed with information to help build national movements that I think, especially for a whole set of historic contingent regions, I think, Christy, especially, you can speak to better than I can, in Latin America at that moment, collided in productive ways with political party projects, right? So that by the time there's in Mar del Plata in Argentina in 2005, you have this big meeting that's supposedly going to be the big next step for the FTAA. You have, right, Kirchner in Argentina, Chavez, Lula, etc. And then you have people who are almost there, like Evo Morales isn't president yet in Bolivia, but the MAS, everyone kind of feels like they're gonna win an election sometime. And that all of those are being energized by the movements, right? And the movements are also helping to teach the parties essentially about international trade, because there is an aspect along with the disruptive mass movement building. There's the like expertise for the movement that a group like Third World Network or Focus on the Global South do. And that you also then see, right, ideas like ALBA, right, attempts to create sort of alternative mechanisms of economic integration among multiple left of center governments. And obviously the pink tide receded. We have this quasi new pink tide. There's a lot to critique about policies and governments in some of the first one. But I think that was a really interesting case study to think about, of how you really need a whole different set of actors. Because to say one quick thing, and then I'll close, about kind of the longer prehistory, is that the idea of sort of these global justice movements, these NGO networks, they existed starting right in before the Cold War, grew a bunch during the Cold War, but were partly, and I see the growth in the 70s and 80s is very reflective of this, partly a response of, well, even if we have a spectrum of feeling about real existing socialism, as it was called at a time, it's not getting us where we wanted to go, right? It's like you're at a point in, say, the mid 70s where groups, will laud some of the things happening in Cuba, but they're not thinking that this state-run communism is like the way to do left politics. And so you're searching for an alternative where you can build sufficient power. But what I think is interesting with the pink tide is it kind of came back around that it's like either you are really going to do state power in some coalitional sense, or there's the counterexample of the Zapatistas, right? But that is very much a like, it's an exit with solidarity, right? It's a concentrate on one locality. And like, we're happy to try to help other people do that, but it's not as world making a project, right? As something like the NIEO or like real existing socialism had been at the time. So I think, right, we're still stuck in kind of that moment, but right, I think movements are continually learning. And I'd still say that I think in many ways Latin America is one of the most interesting kind of, it's the laboratory for empire, and it's a laboratory for anti-empire, given sort of the presence of like definitively left of center government. So I have much more to say about different points, but I'll pause there.
Thank you so much for that. And I definitely, my own coming of sort of political awakening was very much in that moment of the early 2000s, Seattle, DC. Those mobilizations were the ones where I learned this history and learned about these institutions. And I do think that the overriding tension between sort of the vertical versus the horizontal in that moment was really important and was a key kind of point of tension in those movements that you could then see, sort of being rehashed in the moment of Occupy, right? Are we trying to build these sort of small community-based prefigurative ways of living, or are we doing a full frontal attack on these institutions, trying to dismantle them? And I think that that remains a tension in the movements, in various kinds of movements, right? Do the movements that, Walden mentioned, social movements in the Middle East, the Arab Spring, taking down governments, and then the question of sort of what would then replace those governments being very key, right? And so I think that that tension, the sort of horizontal, vertical tension, is one that continues to animate questions about how effective these social movements can and want to be. And so that question of effectiveness, I think, is a really important one. Paul, you've mentioned, the defeat of the FTAA, the Free Trade Area of the Americas. Walden mentioned the sort of complete dissolution. I mean, the WTO exists, but it basically doesn't control anything anymore. It has no ability to sort of be the governance structure that it was. And both of those are definitely in large part because of this nexus between, as you've both mentioned, right, sort of global South governments, particularly left governments, and social movement actors. And so I wonder, in thinking about the kind of efficacy of this activism and advocacy, what are some of the things that, we can say have been effective strategies, effective ways of seeking these kinds of reforms? I guess one way of asking this question is sort of like, we have a long history of disavowal from inside the institutions that these kinds of movements matter, right? So that they can be brought in. Of course, we're consulting civil society, as Bhumika outlined for us so well, that became kind of an important thing. And, our colleague, a fellow HPE advisory board member, Alex Kentala-Kennis, we mentioned this in our last webinar, but he has this great way of talking about this, where he says that basically what an institution like the IMF has developed over the course of the preceding decades is what he calls an escalating commitment to hypocrisy, in that they are increasingly committed to transparency and inclusion and, reform as they continue to churn out the same kinds of conditionalities, the same kinds of liberal policies, et cetera. And so those two things sort of march in opposite directions. And that's why he calls this the escalating commitment to hypocrisy. So I wonder how you all see that, how you all see the tangible results of these kinds of movements. What would people inside the institutions say about this advocacy, and where can we point to ways that this has been important in making, real change? Bhumika, maybe we can start with you. Some of your reflections about where you think, we've seen effective interventions and what kinds of things we might need to consider with regard to that.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, this is a really critical point. I guess I would just start with saying that, sort of effectiveness or efficacy is a really a difficult and loaded term when it comes to counter-hegemonic movements and struggles and initiatives, right? So, the systemic is definitely hard to measure. It's hard to assess in terms of achievements and wins because it's so very subjective. Is it the transformation of neoliberal ideology, or is it short-term policy fixes and narrative shifts? So I would say that in terms of what advocacy movements, which are global, work in coalitions, connect across various issues, have various networks and strategies and tactics and mechanisms that is sort of beyond the scope right now. But what I would say is that there is a power to affect both narrative and policy reforms, but challenging the underlying economic paradigm is a much tougher nut to crack. So I would just put it that way and say, give a few examples. of how the institutions are sensitive to public criticism, which challenge their legitimacy. And civil society, despite their far limited capacity relative to the institutions themselves, and I would say relative to even the resources of academic institutions and expert policy think tanks, and these networks of advocates have been able to draw public attention, media attention to shift the narrative in recent years, and I would say over the last 15 years in particular. So a few examples is that this a few examples of this sort of narrative shift. I can give you a few recent examples in the context of this kind of mission creep or internal evolutions that the Bretton Woods institutions are attempting to do. There has been a powerful kind of narrative that has been co-created by the ecosystem of institutions, including the UN, of billions to trillions, or the cascade approach that really pins down on the financing gap. So, the entire approach has been to really hone in that only private capital can address the financing gap, and global South nations must you know literally bend over backward to incentivize through all sorts of schemes to de-risk private capital, to create the most enabling environment for private capital through various mechanisms. So as recently as December 2024, the World Bank's chief economist called the billions to trillions a fantasy that has failed to deliver as promised. From the Financial Times to The Economist, there have been articles that really talk about how it has not delivered. The magic pony of private finance has not delivered. As of late 2024, what's really interesting is we notice that the World Bank has removed all references to the billions to trillions cascade approach from the website. And under Ajay Banga, the current precedent efforts to crowd in the private sector, of course, are reanimated with especially Trump 2.0. But, I think the critiques and the counter narratives of civil society has helped to really foster broad skepticism on this approach. And I would say another key example that we have that advocates have been quite effective in is, of course, really calling out the austerity paradigm as ideology, and honing in on all the admissions that come from within the IMF as well, from its chief economist, saying that it doesn't hold up to theory or evidence, and the shift from structural adjustment programs to fiscal consolidation over the last 2 decades. There's been a very concerted critique on how, especially with the recent the global financial crisis, and with COVID, the attack on public systems, on social provisioning, the failure of the state to deliver the social contract. We have created narratives and enormous amounts of impact analysis on gendered austerity, and women and girls being the shock absorbers of austerity in the context of climate financing, the right to development, the developmental role of the state. And of course, with this, this central regime of austerity, we see that it changes shape. We see that they appropriate or co-opt our narratives oftentimes. There was such a strong push for social safety nets. So the IMF actually included a line item for social safety net financing within their loan frameworks. But at the same time, the fiscal consolidation or budget cuts became even more intensified. We saw deficit targets turn into surplus targets. So there are all sorts of ways in which you see some change, but then there's an underbelly or a shadow movement that counteracts it. I think there's also been key policy shifts I would like to highlight. And I think for the key policy shifts and concrete policy change making, we need to go outside the limited ambit of the Bretton Woods institutions. And I would say one of the resounding wins in global economic governance is the UN, United Nations Tax Convention, that emerged out of the Third Financing for Development Conference in July 2015, a full decade ago in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And this really shows the arduous decade-long process it takes to go from the proposal and the concept to the actual manifestation. But this was really driven by the leadership of the Africa Group at the UN, where Nigeria tabled a draft resolution in 2022 calling for an intergovernmental inclusive tax negotiation. And it is transformative because it shifted global tax rules out of the closed forums of the OECD and calls it a rich countries club that lacks legitimacy to make decisions on tax in light of the fact that over a third of the world's countries are not involved and not participating in the OECD. And it really enacted a transformative agenda for democratic economic governance through the UN One Nation, One Vote mechanism. And it's notable here that the Africa Group's resolution includes specific references to international civil society participation. This did not happen accidentally. It is a direct result of the absolutely enormous, effective, and committed campaigning of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, the Tax Justice Network, and in a collaborative ecosystem with academics and with policy experts and other forces. So, the oft-claimed slogan, if you're not on the table, you're on the menu, has really yielded something. Within the IMF, we can talk about these policy fixes such as the special drawing rights issuances in 2009, 2021. Civil society really led the momentum and pushed very hard for these issuances to create fiscal space, but also more structurally in reconceptualizing the special drawing right as a counter-cyclical development finance tool, a key component of the global financial safety net. Recently, this year, well, in the last year, the surcharges campaign is a great example of a change, a multi-year campaign calling for an end to IMF surcharges, and it led to a revision of the policy, a significant reduction in penalty charges to countries who have borrowed in excess of their quota limits. So there was a real narrative shift here about these surcharge fees being a deterrent to countries borrowing above their quota levels to being a real unjust imposition. So what we can debate, are these changes systemic? Do they really create a systemic turn away from the larger, agenda? So that's one of the key things that really, we can really get into this perennial tension between the low-hanging fruits of pragmatism, the short-term policy fixes versus the systemic and structural changes that really address power and equity, that address economic sovereignty, that democratize governance. So this shift is always there, and I think advocates are very aware of this tension, and the strategy is to do both. The strategy is to do the low-hanging pragmatism, the short-term policy fix, and the systemic to hold space for both and to not make it a kind of reductionist contradiction.
Thank you for that. I think one framework that might help us think about that is one that comes from a totally other activist milieu, organizing milieu, and that are the folks who are seeking to organize to abolish prisons and policing. And they have this concept of non-reformist reforms, right? Reforms of the system that actually take power and resources away from the structures and redistribute them in ways that are not then therefore, sort of engaging and propping up the systems of oppression that we're fighting against. And I think that might be an interesting way to think about that. Walden, before we let you go, I know it's so late in Bangkok. I was thinking as Bhumika was talking that, some of the successes that have been heralded here, the defeat of the FTAA, the sort of dismantling of the WTO's power, the rhetorical shift away from neoliberalism that we are in the moment, the kind of question of the post-neoliberal transition, some of the strongest advocates of that have been the right-wing nationalists, right? We're in a moment, you mentioned Trump in your opening moments. And so I wonder how we should think about the tension between our own movements that have been working for 30, 40, 50 years against kind of corporate globalization and the way that right-wing nationalists, anti-globalist movements led by the likes of Trump, Bolsonaro, Milei, how we might think about the tension between those. And do you see the kind of taking up of this anti-neoliberal language more broadly as a victory, or do we need to do more work to sort of move beyond the kind of revanchist, nationalist, inward-looking impulse that comes with the Trump kind of movement?
Well, let me just bring up three things, and I'll come to that at the point. Um, Looking back, it was during the very crisis of socialism, or actually existing socialism, and its collapse in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union, that did not deter social movements from organizing. They might not have had the comprehensive vision of a socialist movement, but basically they knew, you know, what were the institutions that were really enemies of the people. And this is, the late 80s, when that crisis of socialism was happening, was also the time that you had this movements against structural adjustment, that, against, and then becoming also the movement against the World Trade Organization, um, so basically, what we saw here really was, people did not need theory, to see, you know, what was wrong. And they knew that these institutions, which were really the political canopy of global capitalism, were also the points that had to be attacked, and uh, and um, and if possible dismantled. So that's the first thing that I would say, that basically there was just this sense that these were the key institutions that you went after. The second thing is the priority of action. I still remember that, prior to Seattle, you had many UN studies that already showed that neoliberalism and structural adjustment were not working. And in fact, had very, very good statistics. UNCTAD came up with so many, but they were regarded as factoids. And really, the paradigm just, of neoliberalism at that time was just screening out these facts. And then Seattle happened. And what, Seattle happened, it was such a world historic event that basically after that, what do we see with people like Joseph Stiglitz, Jeffrey Sachs, George Soros? A whole bunch of people began to question globalization. And so the legitimation that was made not by theoretical and academic stuff, but by action out in the streets that brought down the WTO, that was so important, in sort of speeding up the delegitimation of neoliberalism and globalization. So again, I can't see that really happening without what happened in Seattle, and then followed, of course, by what happened in Cancun later. So, and so the priority of action over theory, and And then the last thing that you mentioned is, yes, we provided the critique, we provided the foot soldiers, and the right ate our lunch. It did. I mean, basically, the articulation of the criticism of neoliberalism and globalization, that wasn't the right, that was us. But then they were the ones who were able to take advantage and appeal to sectors of the population that could no longer rely on the traditional parties because the traditional working class parties had become neoliberal. And so and then the non-neoliberal wing of the left was not able to challenge electorally and on the continuing hegemony of the mainstream parties. And so this leads to the situation whereby the anti-neoliberal, anti-globalist, fascist movements on the right, have the momentum. And I'm not going to say that it's going to be very easy for us to stop that momentum, but and I'm not exactly sure if there are any points whereby we could unite with that base, uh, because the right doesn't move with rational analysis. The points of unity of the right is always very emotionally based. And in fact, they glory in irrationalism. So these are not people that are open to the rational bias that we have on the left, okay, which is also our weakness, our strength and our weakness. So I would say that, of course, history does not stop, and how do we regain that momentum that is with the right at this point in time? And I would just end there with a question, because this then comes into the dynamics of anti-fascist organizing in both the global North and the global South, which is a really, really big, huge task of political organizing at this point in time. The last thing I would just like to say is that, yes, the era of liberal internationalism is over. And the World Bank and the IMF and the WTO and all these different institutions are very much in trouble at this point. And I would say that both, and clearly, when it comes to the WTO, Trump has, led in making it even more marginal and irrelevant. He doesn't have much use for the World Trade the World Bank and the IMF. And I have a feeling that the World Bank and the IMF are just sort of waiting, in fear when he begins to turn his eyes on them. But so the old multilateral structure and whatever reforms, quote unquote, they're trying to push or co-opt, I think in many ways they're going away. I mean, they're sliding off, within this new world of what Adam Tooze calls the polycrisis, and Gramsci calls, an era of, the old world is dying, but the new world still has to be born. And very much, other actors coming in like China and the BRICS, and the US sort of under Trump, despite the aggressive rhetoric, becoming more and more, as one author called it, it seems to be following this sort of isolationist uh, thrust that Japan and Korea had in the 18th and 19th century of becoming hermit, isolated kingdoms, very hostile to the world. And so anyway, that's my sense that we're embarked on a whole very, very fluid international situation at this point.
Yeah, I think
And
that's absolutely right. And obviously the US's complete attack, the kind of dismantling of USAID, one of the most important sort of soft power arms that promoted the multilateral and bilateral development around the world, is really indicative of that. What this new era will look like is obviously a very open question, and what the repercussions of, if Trump is this 4-year interregnum, what the repercussions of that will be going forward are so important. I want folks to, we will have a couple of minutes for Q&A for the panel. So if there are other questions that people want to put into the Q&A function, we can try and get those out. I think one has been put in that Walden basically just answered. So if there are others, if there's anything else that people want to ask our panelists here, please do that now. I'll conclude by just asking Paul, as the historian on the panel, to reflect on this question of what our current moment, how you think that is an outcome of, or what lessons we should draw from this history of activism against free trade, which is one of the areas that you've looked at so much. How do you see this current moment, and where do you think the kind of advocacy and activism that's happening now should be focused in this context?
Yeah, I mean, I'll actually go back to the example I was talking about before and approach it from another angle, which is that, and this is not just a Latin American story, but I mean, George W. Bush was kind of good for the international left, right? It was like a lot of people rallied, a lot of energy, and we're seeing sort of this Trump effect may be happening now, right? I mean, they're fairly tepid social democratic parties, but the fact that Australian Labor and the Canadian Liberals achieved these much bigger wins than were predicted. And I think there might be something, and I'm trying to think in sort of the historian mind, which can lead to seeing silver linings, even though I tend to hate silver linings arguments, as if there's a world system where the question is less all focused on the hegemonic power of the US, which I think can sometimes lead to sort of some odd places, right? It can lead to campism, right? Where it's the enemy of my enemy has to be my friend. But it also can lead to sort of a shallow focus on this like bad nation state over systemic analysis, that both the US being kind of a cartoon villain in the world system of this sort of, right, we're going to a 19th century of, we don't deal with many international institutions, but like maybe we'll like invade you or launch a military attack or try to buy you, literally. May create a space for civil society similar to that Bush era, or also frankly similar to the 1970s, which was another high point, right, with the NIO and kind of international left, where when the US is in a bit of retreat, right, creates an idea of, I guess a political scientist would call it like an opportunity structure, but just a time to think more systemically and be less focused on a single easy to identify bad guy. And then a second point I'd say is, as maybe some of these international institutions may, for at least certain countries, certain parts of the world, become less important. We haven't also talked about kind of Belt and Road and China's emergence also as a major development financer. But with that kind of movement, we may see just like, sorry, I actually temporarily have lost my train of thought, but I'm actually going to pause rather than trying to.
Sure, that's
It may
fine.
come
That's
back,
fine.
but
Yeah, no, I think
yeah,
you're right. The kind of questions of what the opportunities are in this moment, I think are an important one. And the question of, yeah, are there ways to reach the what seems like the
yeah,
base of these right-wing nationalist moments? Are there points of convergence? Are there ways that, the kinds of organizations and movements that have been so important to what was the anti-globalization, the global justice movement,
yeah,
could kind of retake some of this stage? I think
yeah.
remain to be seen. I want to raise one question from
Oh,
the
and
Q&A
actually,
before. Oh, sure, go ahead.
just very quickly, what I remember what I was going to say is that I think there then are opportunities for both reimagining systemic forms, but also in kind of global anti-authoritarian struggle where you can build robust internationalist muscle, right? Because like the left in the US has a lot to learn from like left in India, the left in Hungary, the left in Brazil, right? And everyone has an interest in each other because, as much as we can talk about an isolationist right, C, right? Like CPACs being held in Bush. So that need for things like the Progressive International and other networks will create a space where I do think there'll be another reviving some of the global justice movements discuss real alternative systems in a way where it's a conversation about economic justice, but also democracy, but not shallow democracy, but about what is profound democracy based on many people's now renewed experience of authoritarianism, nexus where a robust new global justice movement could emerge.
Thank you, Paul. You cut out just a little bit. So in the transcript of this, we might have to ask you to clarify that just a little bit. But I'll ask one question from our audience here. Tim Herschel Burns writes in the Q&A, while the discussion is mostly focused on the left-wing anti-globalization movement and its outside strategy, I'm wondering what this period teaches us about the benefits and challenges of coalition building with less radical forces. In particular, the Jubilee debt movement relied on the influence of the church, and there was an unlikely lineage from ACT UP to George W. Bush to PEPFAR. So the question here is sort of like not just the sort of outside and most radical strategy, but what have been the ways to ally with maybe more moderate political parties, groups like the church groups, et cetera. I don't know, Bhumika, do you want to speak to that question about the sort of coalitional alliances that have been important here?
Sure, yes, and I would love to also hear Walden's insights since he's really led the momentum of many diverse coalitions as well. So I would just say on the example of Jubilee, yes, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, advocacy coalitions, particularly on debt, which, let's face it, is the linchpin of economic justice, right? And I think there's been really interesting evolutions in how sovereign debt is perceived, how the history of debt colonialism, the way in which debt is a central tool of subordination, compliance, enforcement, especially the linkaging with austerity as a means of repayment, and since the post-war era, a prescription of repudiation and fair restructuring processes where, today we have a scenario of profound debt crises across the global south,
Yes.
rising out of global financial crisis and exacerbated during COVID, with really no alternative but continual repayment, where we see all these schemes from the G20's Common Framework, etc., not really delivering restructuring or relief. And here you have the Jubilee movement that really galvanizes and activates a very neglected base, that of the religious sector, which there are so many different sort of groups of populations that are untapped, in terms of how to galvanize their moral outrage, their sense of compassion, or their sense of indignation, to make it a priority issue. And I think we can learn a lot from the right wing. We can learn a lot from the far right in the sense about how to really activate that one pinpoint of concern, right? And this is where our ethos of systemic and structural, of the history and politics, doesn't behoove us necessarily all the time. But the way in which coalitions have been operating is that they have grassroots, grass tops. You have radical, you have much more muted and mainstream. You have across geographies, you have across sectors, and that is a powerful coalition. That is a powerful coalition, one that has these diversities and that contain the contradictions and tensions within the diverse groups of people, by centering on a united goal. And that united goal can be framed differently, right? For radical activists, it can be dead colonialism, it can be, right to self-determination, it can be the decolonial ethos. For the Jubilee religious constituency, it can be one that taps into religious narratives of forgiveness and atonement, of conscience. So I think this is absolutely key, absolutely key. And we have this also in terms of other movements around climate and trade justice, where it's focused on, say, the next generation, on women and girls. You have, of course, the discourses and narratives of racial capitalism. We can approach this through so many different perspectives and vantage points, but I think it's key here to have an intentional priority of centering the grassroots demands, the grassroots movements from the global South. And the reason why this is key is because these are the bodies, the constituencies, the lives, the communities at the center, at the nexus, at the lived experiences. And I do think there's something really critical about having this grassroots imperative of, what are their arguments and concerns. And here there has been, I'll just point to the example of debt, a really profound tension, right, from the grassroots. Some of the things we hear: don't owe, won't pay. This is debt colonialism. We need historical, colonial, and climate reparations. We need to address the linkage between climate and debt, right? That's been a massive turn in the debt justice movement, of really making those links with climate justice and debt justice. And then the tension is in policy advocacy, which is disproportionately led by professionalized organizations staffed with economists and social scientists, where in policy advocacy, it's been rather difficult to say don't owe, won't pay when in dialogue with institutions. So there the focus is the sovereign debt restructuring mechanism, the reforms needed to the G20, issues like comparability of treatment, the private sector cooperate and coordinate with debt restructuring, calling for moratoriums in the wake of exogenous shocks. Right now, there's a massive attention on credit rating agencies and the ways in which they worsen and exacerbate debt distress through their risk premiums that spike up the cost of capital. And this interplay between grassroots and grass tops is really critical to navigate. It's not consistent. There's no uniform policy or principle guiding it, but this is the constant navigation. But I would say the more diverse, the more eclectic, the more heterogeneous, the more tense the coalition is, the more powerful it can be. Especially the more structural the issues get. Thanks.
Great. I think that's a fabulous place for us to end. I would really like to thank my panelists. Walden, thank you for staying up so late with us tonight. We really appreciate it. And thank you to Paul. Thank you to Bhumika. Thank you to the BU Global Development Policy Center. We're really glad to have had all of the participants here joining us and everybody watching on YouTube. And these webinars will be posted for folks to watch, and we'll be transcribing them and putting out a report of all the webinars together. So do stay tuned for that. And thank you all for being here today. We really